Welcome to The Business Behind Sport, the award-winning podcast from Ankura. Each episode, we sit down with sport industry leaders to explore insights, trends, and perspectives on the issues influencing the business side of sports today.
European football is often defined by its biggest clubs, its biggest stars, and the most prestigious competition. But its long-term strength lies in its depth, its leagues, and its local clubs, and the interconnected pyramid that links them all. So how do we ensure that clubs are not only sustainable, but represented, supported, and heard in shaping the future of the game? Welcome to the Ankura Business Behind Sport podcast with me, Jonny Gray. As the football world turns its attention from the World Cup to the start of the new European season, it's the perfect time to explore the challenges and opportunities facing clubs across the continent. And to do that, I'm delighted to be joined by Gareth Farrelly. Gareth is a former professional footballer. You might remember him playing for Everton, Aston Villa, Bolton Wanderers. And he is now the head of the Union of European Clubs. And in addition to that, if that wasn't enough, as a lawyer, he's a senior associate at Glazers LLP. So bringing a legal and a player perspective to his role as the head of the Union of European Clubs. Gareth, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Jonny. It's a pleasure to be here and have a chat with you. We've actually sat on a panel before, haven't we, which was extremely well received. So I hope we do as well this afternoon.
So maybe let's just start before we get into the Union of European Clubs, looking at where we are. We've just seen the biggest, some will say the best, certainly commercially the largest World Cup ever playing out across North America. Here we are, beginning of August, and life carries on. From your perspective, how do you see that as a former footballer, but also as the head of the UEC?
I think there's an interesting mix to all of those elements. I think every competition has always been the biggest and the best since the last one. And I'm sure this season or upcoming season or when the last season ended will still be presented as that. I think that will always be the narrative. I think there's a uniqueness to the competition that we've just seen, because one of the things that's interesting for me is the ebb and flow of how the media operates with regards to, we heard about protestations and concerns before the tournament, as we have done before the previous two World Cups. And now we're in a situation where people understand the trends to that. So obviously once the football starts, it invariably distracts or negates that level of criticism. So I think there's still a uniqueness to kind of some of those challenges that have presented themselves, let alone a final, which, if you had sat with an ardent protector of football to say that we're going to have a World Cup final with, in theory, 4 quarters and a 30-minute halftime show, how do you think that protects the integrity and the beauty of the game? So definitely a lot to look at. I think the challenge for us all, and again, Jonny, your skill set in being able to communicate for me is for the majority of clubs, and some of those already are now back in competitive fixtures, be it in some European countries, some of club competitions, but fundamentally qualification for UEFA club competitions, which is such a huge thing for a large amount of clubs with regards to revenue for the season ahead. So fascinating. I think we always, two of the key buzzwords around football invariably are interesting and fascinating because they've got so many different meanings. But I think it's definitely been a fascinating World Cup. And I think there's a lot of interesting challenges ahead. You look at, Gianni Infantino, if you look at the governance within football, and I know governance is a topic we're going to cover today, but there's people now starting to talk about potential challenges to the re-election of Gianni Infantino, which before the tournament was something that would not have been contemplated by anybody. Some people may have favoured it, but it definitely wasn't part of the discussion. And you start to see the politics and the machinations and people starting to deploy their early strategies as to what will come next. But I think what's interesting for some of the people I speak to is that the value is on the pitch. You look at the players, you look at the stories, you look at the fans, you look at all of the different memories that people will take from the World Cup. But I think sometimes it's important to emphasize who is the guardian of the game, who's going to protect the game from a situation where it becomes so far removed, which is hydration breaks or whichever way you want to present them. And, in fairness, with regards to the next tournament of note, which will be the Euros in 2028, in many ways, the testing area of the World Cup. I think UEFA have already rolled back from some of the decisions that have been made by FIFA during this competition cycle. So the game is never not fascinating or never not challenging, but I think it's going to be interesting what comes out in the next kind of weeks and months ahead. Aside from a defined narrative about biggest, best ever, most revenue, most whatever, because as you said in your introduction, how does that translate to the whole of the game?
Yeah, well, exactly. And that's why I thought it was really good timing to have you on, Gareth, because this element of the game, the World Cup and everything that goes around it, is in many ways so far removed from the grassroots, but they all play down to each other. And you talked about whose game is it and so on. I want to talk a bit about your playing career because I know there are going to be fans of Gareth Farrelly listening into this.
Well, two of them.
I'll do them. But let's talk about, whose game is this? So for listeners who are not familiar, how would you describe the role of the Union of European Clubs? And where does that sit within the sort of European football landscape?
Landscape's a good word, Johnny, as is, ecosystems and the game. I think football is quite unique with regards to that stakeholder structure. So I think in simplifying it, and not to do your podcast a disservice by doing it the opposite way around, I think one of the questions we would always ask is, what do we want the game to look like in 5 years, right? So I think we're probably 4 years down the road from when we said that first. And I think some of the dangers and some of the concerns that we would have had when a question was stated initially are very much still at the forefront of our thinking. So with regards to the Union of European Clubs, UEC, for people who don't know, is a club representative organisation that has been set up to represent the interests of small and medium-sized clubs across Europe. So historically, a lot of the stakeholder organisations were set up in Switzerland, which is where, a lot of the sporting bodies are based for different reasons. The UEC was incorporated and set up in Brussels, Belgium, and its successes to date have been very much on the value of relationships we were able to forge and build with the European institutions. And that has come from the clear story, narrative, whatever you want to call it, of being able to say that football is not just about that elite top level. There's maybe in excess of 1,500 professional clubs in Europe. And what we've seen over the years is an erosion of those clubs' rights or voice to be able to contribute to the conversation as to what football should look like or what's important. It's not naive to turn around and talk about the importance of those clubs from a community perspective, what they contribute. So again, to differentiate slightly between grassroots, which is pretty much amateur, but from a professional level. And that's all relative. So I think landscape ecosystem for us, the objective is to be able to advocate for and promote the voices of small and medium-sized clubs across Europe. What the differentiator has been is the UEC was set up on the premise of one club, one vote. So as opposed to other organisations and structures, specifically club representative bodies, there isn't a tiered membership scheme. There isn't different voting rights for different clubs based on size, scale, or coefficients or qualifications. It's fundamentally about representing the interests of that large body of clubs. Now, equally respectful of the big clubs and the value they bring and how they've driven increases in exposure, commerciality, revenue, promotion of the game. But fundamentally, I think you have to be very, very careful that all of the decision-making powers fundamentally reside with those elites that will naturally look to work in their own interests. So I think there has to be a balance to that. And I think the UEC would be very much a counterbalance to the current stakeholder system. So objective longer term is for the UEC to be a formally recognised body within the current European football structure. The other club organisation at the moment now following the World Cup are moving towards global domination, with regards to the expansion of Club World Cups and different things, which still form a part of that kind of governance conversation as to what football is going to look like in the next few years. So just again, from a background point of view, the initial kind of couple of years was around representation and demonstrating value and trying to promote that particular large group who may have less resources than some of the others. But in kind of the last 12 to 18 months, it's also been around developing policies and policies that fit within that current ecosystem, but also would benefit a large majority of those clubs. There's 3 policies that we've put at the forefront of that we would love to see implemented or at least be a part of the conversation.
Let's come back to those because I definitely want to spend time looking at those. So again, just sort of bringing that to life a bit. If people are thinking about the sort of hierarchy of the pyramid, you're representing that sort of group of clubs that are maybe operating in the second tier to the 5th tier of national football across Europe?
Yeah, but Johnny, some top tier teams as well. It depends. And it goes to your introduction, which was really good because the fundamental reality is every team will start this season. We talk about we're not paused at a moment in time as to we don't know what's going to happen for the season ahead. But every club is aspirational. Every club is starting that season, irrespective of what league they're in, thinking, this is the year. We want to compete for honours. It doesn't necessarily turn out like that for many, which is why everybody loves the jeopardy and everybody loves the European sports model, right? Which is that level of competition. But I think there's another side to that, which is important, which is what is the direction of travel for the game? You know, we look at key issues which you discuss at length around leadership and governance, and where are we going with that? What was interesting is that some of these conversations have always taken place in whispers, and everybody will talk about what they believe to be the issues. But fundamentally, it's very difficult to drive change. So how does that happen? So there's a unique kind of ecosystem around having to try and address all of these issues in an information and kind of communication age. It's not easy.
And we spoke just after this had all been launched. Just bring me up to speed on how many members now, how many clubs have joined the UEC?
The UEC would have 150 members.
Yeah, so quite a lot of clubs.
Yeah, so the challenges for us is that we've been pretty consistent over the last few years with that, despite the other club organisation changing its model with regards to recruiting and looking to bring clubs into their group. And for us, again, in some ways, that's a compliment. But what you're wanting is an educated, empowered club body that can hold people to account.
So we'll come back to the policies that you're trying to take forward in a moment, because I know listeners really want to hear those. But here you are, you're running UEC, representing 150 odd clubs in the sort of middle tiers of professional football across Europe. And you are yourself a former professional footballer. And I know, as we said, the fans will tune in because they'll want legendary stories about your time with Villa or Everton or Bolton Wanderers. But having re-qualified as a lawyer, how do you bring your experience as a professional footballer in your role now with the UEC? You played at the elite level, but you saw the pyramid, you came up through the pyramid, and you will have seen the discrepancies between resources and funding at different levels. How do you look back on that now in this new role you've got?
It's a great question. The simple, honest answer is that you're wholly unaware. I think, it becomes interesting. Like as a young player, your sun, moon and stars is around your own existence and your own kind of bubble you live in. And again, I don't see anything wrong in that. I think the point for me has always been that I care about the game. I think you listen to a lot of people and they will always talk about their love of the game never really diminishes. I think the challenge is protecting that and seeking to, hold to account those in positions of leadership or governance. That is a priority. And I think that's becoming more and more difficult. You've got the challenges of capital, all of the different governance challenges that are there. And again, it comes back to the World Cup to some degrees. There's a differentiator there between I played football for 16 years. I was very, very fortunate.
And very good.
No. But I'm saying, I played for Aston Villa, which is a huge club. I had a fabulous time there in many ways. I moved to the club then that I supported as a boy, which was Everton. And I played there and, had aspirations of competing and winning trophies, which wasn't the case, but ended up being involved in a very, very small memory for Everton, which was to avoid relegation, which is something, again, that I could have never possibly contemplated as an Everton fan. And then I had 5 years at Bolton Wanderers, which coincided with that being a very, very successful time for them, and managed to play for Ireland. But I think the glory of my transition from being a footballer, and the legal story is a different story on its own, because I became a lawyer. I make a joke about it, tidy up all the mistakes I made when I was a player. Right?
Get all those NDAs out there.
Yeah, I'm still not clear yet, but with regards to kind of understanding what a lot of my experiences were while I played. So I think you can't shortcut those things. I moved into an incredibly challenging profession and qualified as a lawyer. I'm in a private practice with a law firm and I get to do a lot of interesting stuff. So I made my mistakes in my 20s, Johnny. I'm getting older now, grey hair. Right. I tend to go to bed now thinking I had 8 things to do today in the office and I did 2 of them. So that's what waits for me tomorrow. I don't necessarily spend a lot of my time thinking about, woe be me, I wish I was still involved now. The game's changed exponentially with regards to the wealth that's in it. And, thinking has always been around the game. Like I look back on people that seem to be at the front of a lot of these things with regards to following the US model from a commercial point of view, with regards to broadcasting, revenue, opportunity, athletes. And I look at where that's at now. But all of those things have kind of formed my experience and the prism by which I kind of see things now. And my day to day, I'm very, very lucky to be involved in a lot of interesting things. Talk about the UEC, like I'm not say running it, but I'm the CEO of the UEC. But obviously there's a small operational team, which is the co-founder who was the executive director of a small club in Zagreb in Croatia. You look at operations director is from Bulgaria, who was involved in club football and the federation for years. You look at the president, there's been a change now, was the owner of Union Saint-Gilloise, who are recent Champions League participants and league winners last year. And the new president of the UEC now is executive director from University Craiova in Romania, who won the league for the first time in a number of years last year. So, when we say smaller and medium, you're back to that little football competition part where nobody likes to think of themselves as being small or medium. But the point is they're all clubs that are competing within that ecosystem. And from a UEC perspective, every weekend you take great pride in seeing those clubs develop and compete and be successful. So it's like, not that there's an expectation that this hierarchy, which you mentioned, becomes interesting, doesn't it? Because fundamentally, there's a group of super clubs now from revenue. And if you look at how that's changed so much over a short period of time, that are instrumental or seeking to endorse and strengthen their position with regards to the decision making in the game. And I think there has to be a diversity of thought, and there has to be a group that can advocate for that majority. So some may say naive, but it's what we advocate for. We've been successful so far, but I don't think we're finished yet.
Well, that's very clear. So, Gareth, let's talk a little bit about the three key themes that you're progressing as the UEC on behalf of your member clubs.
So I think it comes back to what you said about as a season starts, what are the concerns for a lot of those clubs or stakeholders within the system, right? So I think for us, one of the early policies, the first one we developed was called the Player Development Reward, which was a policy that in its simplest form looks to reward clubs that develop players who go on to play at the highest level. Now, fresh off the press for this podcast is that we can have a really interesting conversation about the much publicized club benefits program, which is basically clubs being remunerated for the players competing in the World Cup. And again, how that's been negotiated and agreed from the higher end. We believe that the player development reward would be equally applicable for international football. So what you're basically looking at is a portion of the club competition's revenue, 5%, being taken and then being distributed to clubs across the whole ecosystem who have played a part in the development of players based on a formula around the amount of minutes played by that player. It's been quite interesting and different iterations based on, your audience. Not to say, here's one I made earlier, but in looking at the World Cup, you would have a situation, say if you were talking about somebody like John McGinn, where based on his last year Champions League quarterfinals Aston Villa got to, that £262,000 would have gone to St Mirren. Jules Koundé, who's Barcelona, €768,000 would have gone to Bordeaux, which was the club he played at up until he was 22. If you look at Cucurella, who was at Getafe as a young player, €360,000 would have gone to them. And Julian Ryerson, who's at Dortmund, Viking FK would have got €191,000. So there's lots of different examples of clubs like that. Talk about some of the more higher profile players. You have Virgil van Dijk, 1.48 million would have gone to Willem II in Holland, which is the club he played at till he was 19. So there's lots of different things around this. So the policy's simple, works within the current structure, doesn't conflict with any of the regulations that are in place at the moment, but creates an interest and incentivizes those clubs that currently help develop players, but up until a certain point within the current structures. It starts a different conversation. So for us, when you go back to the origins of the UEC, was very much myself and Dennis, who met doing a football law program with UEFA, having a conversation around some of the issues he found working in his club in Zagreb. And it was like, we've contributed to the national team. We develop players consistently. 70% of our revenue comes from international transfers. But how do we look to reward those clubs and incentivize those clubs to continue to develop talent rather than have a situation where the big clubs just come in and cherry pick those players and then kind of consolidate that, which is something that's happened over a period of years. So that was where that started.
Well, I mean, that is a fantastically interesting proposal. And if you're St Mirren and all those other clubs, you're going to be really up for that. Where are you with this? How do you take a proposal like that forward? You talked about being in Brussels and, I guess, lobbying. Tell me more about how you're going to try and turn this from an idea into something that happens.
Well, given your background and where you're at, it's a great point. So one is visibility. Two is this policy was developed as the other two policies have been developed with all of our members, with specific input from different people at different times. So I think the first step is getting it out there. And I think the challenge we have sometimes, and I'm not sure if I've done it well or not, is it has to be quite simple, because the more complicated it becomes, the more difficult it is to try and explain to people, right? And to give examples. So some of the figures I've cited, we were able to kind of publish during the Euros, but you've done it cleverly because it brings the conversation back to the point about current governance structure. From our side, you have something in football, which is the Social Dialogue Committee in professional football. So again, what's the composition of that committee as it stands? Can the UCC be a part of that, which is what we want to be, so that as and when different conversations take place, we have an opportunity to present these policies. So with regards to the PDO, we have spoken to all of the stakeholders about this policy and it's been really well received. The challenge for us, as you've rightly identified, is it's one thing presenting a policy and being able to advocate for it, but how do you get us into the conversation as to what comes next? And with regards to what you said about the end of the World Cup and the start of a new season, we're now into a really, really interesting period because the discussions are now starting around solidarity for that next UEFA club competition rights cycle, which will be from 27 to 31. So what we're saying is that we're not asking for a seat at the table just to sit at the table. We want to be a formidable voice promoting policies like this, but also then advocating for some of the peripheral issues around this. So if we look at the governance, which was always never far away, if you look at the Super League case, if you look at the Diarra case, if you look at what happened just before the World Cup with regards to the agreement between FIFPro and FIFA around the new regulations on the status and transfer of players, for us, you're bringing it back to that consultation, who was involved, how are those decisions made, and who will benefit from those in the longer term. So we have the new RSTP, which will not be implemented now until the 1st of January 2027, but there's certain elements around that haven't been forensically analysed yet because of the World Cup, but will now have to be a part of the conversation. So for us, it emphasises the importance of the stakeholders, Social Dialogue Committee, you mentioned it, lobbying, and who's advocating for that majority of clubs and the impact some of these things may have on them. So as an example, one of the points that's come out of the new agreement is that players who earn 150,000 euros or less, 5% of the transfer fee is going to be paid to that player, right? So again, the forensic analysis of that is who has made that decision and what's the impact of that going to be on clubs that are not at the high elite end and dealing with huge transfer fees. This isn't going to have any impact on them. But again, we need to get into the granular detail of what that's going to look like now, because that's going to have some form of impact. Equally, the new UEFA club competition cycle, more and more clubs now are identifying that in order to be sustainable, and again, sustainability means different things to different people, the only way that's going to happen is by playing in UEFA club competitions. And some of them are in turn advocating for reducing the size of domestic leagues. So what would the impact be on domestic leagues, which comes back to my whole point around the importance of domestic leagues, that's the most important area. So smaller, medium-sized clubs, but also the importance of domestic leagues and how you communicate some of these concerns. And it's very difficult because, again, you understand from that communications point of view is that football moves so quickly that it's very, very hard to get into the particular detail before people are kind of discussing what that next issue is. And that's one of our major challenges, is being able to kind of bring people with you. So the PDR is not an aggressive policy. It's a policy that at the time would benefit over 1,200 clubs in Europe.
So, Gareth, really interesting. In the interest of time, tell me about the second policy area you're progressing.
So the second policy, again, is in looking at some of the issues currently, is a domestic media rights protection policy. So basically, you have a situation where what we're saying is that now the value of UEFA club competition rights is impacting on domestic leagues.
In the sense that the broadcasters want to broadcast the sort of UEFA competitions, and therefore the value of the rights to broadcast football further down the pyramid has been decreased.
Yeah, again, looking at it from a domestic leagues perspective. So what we have basically said is that, again, on a European level, if there is a country where UEFA club competition rights is more than domestic league rights, there should be a percentage paid to the leagues. So 30%. So like a form of levy, if you like, but that then would give those clubs an opportunity to be more competitive rather than have a situation where, I come back to one of the words I used earlier around jeopardy, is that the predictability of domestic leagues is becoming more entrenched because the big teams that play in UEFA club competitions, especially the Champions League, year on year, have a position of superiority purely on revenue. Now, again, Johnny, there'll be some people will turn around and go, oh, money doesn't buy you success. People still make mistakes. There's people who have spent huge amounts of money and got it wrong, and sport, it's competitive. But I think you're returning to the fundamental point of a key one being, so solidarity is around PDR. And solidarity has shifted with regards to its description over the last few years now, where some people are saying, solidarity is a handout. So again, from a UEC perspective, we would say that that's very much not the case. What you're basically saying is solidarity is a recognition for all of those clubs' contribution to that ecosystem, the player development. Like you say, the volunteers, the community club where people do all of the things that a club would not survive without for very, very little.
What I like about the PDR is that it's rewarding success. St Mirren was successful in producing John McGinn, and therefore years later, that's recognised.
Yeah. The domestic media rights point is as much around competitive balance, which is the same thing.
I get that. And the third area?
The final policy, which has been, released more recently, is a new model for revenue distribution for the UEFA club competitions. And that's, not saying radical, but a very, very marked shift from kind of where we are today with regards to revenue distribution. And I think sometimes, again, that's the danger of the conversations now, that what people will be speaking about as well will give the majority a little bit more of a lot more. And that will enable us to be able to do what we want to do. So I think what we've spoken about doing is it's a full redesign of the distribution framework. And it's very much to kind of preserve the sporting incentives while reducing domestic competition imbalance, which has been caused by UEFA revenues. So the simple how would be to reallocate the value pillar into a starting fee and performance and shift solidarity from non-participating clubs to league level pools. So in its simplest form, if you kind of look at where it sits now, there's the different elements of starting fee, performance and a value pillar, which is linked to obviously previous coefficient, whereas now we would look to increase the starting fee and performance around this. So the allocation between competitions would change greatly.
If people don't know, UEFA do distribute hundreds of millions of pounds in solidarity payments down the pyramid. I guess what you're saying, Gareth, is you acknowledge that, but you would like it to be done slightly differently and presumably a little bit more. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. But again, like in moving from a simplistic viewpoint, you're not saying UEFA don't do good things, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I think there's a reality there that any governing body have a thankless task. So this comes back to fundamentally all roads lead back to governance and leadership. What we're basically saying is that when them conversations are taking place as to what these things look like, and there's incredibly bright people involved in all of these things, what we're saying is that one of the major voices within European football needs to be in that room.
Yeah. So more two-way discussion, if you like.
It's not two ways though.
Multi-way.
Yeah, because I think that this is the glory of, a purported democracy, isn't it? Is that if you think about the importance of fans in that conversation, the importance of leagues, you think about the importance of players. So all I'm saying is that if you look across different industries, there's different bodies that look after different people within that hierarchy. So again, ECA, EFC, whatever you want to call them, they do some incredibly good work, right? And I'm not saying anything against that. But what I'm saying is fundamentally that's an organization that is set up, its structure and its governance is set up primarily to protect the elite clubs. So within that, what we're saying is the UEC and those majority of clubs should be a part of that discussion, not part of a subcommittee or a subgroup or existing on the peripheries, but actually a true meaningful partner in those discussions. And I think football has done that quite well. But equally, back to what we talk about, a legal crossover, whereas football enjoyed an autonomy specificity of sport previously, we've now seen cases relatively recently around football and how that perception is shifting with regard to football's ability to govern itself. And I think we only have to go to the independent football regulator to see that. So there's a massive interest piece. Like football, you look at the World Cup again, like you look at the universal infatuation in some cases people have for football, right? But it's a very, very complicated ecosystem. And from our side, like anything, the more informed you are, the better equipped you are to address some of these issues. But they're important issues that need to be visible rather than decisions being made and then people being tapped on the head afterwards and told, as I said, congratulations, you're going to get a little bit more of a lot more, which will always protect that hierarchy. And I think that's very much more important and more relevant now, given some of the governance issues that we've seen. And we don't know where all of these will play out.
Well, we don't, Gareth, but it's been brilliant having you on the Business Behind Sport podcast at this really interesting time. FIFA revenues for the World Cup yet to be fully calculated, but, in the billions.
There's a point for us, Johnny, a last point, and I'm not trying to finish my case off if I've made it well or not, right? But the point is that if you think back now to the discussions that are already taking place about another expanded World Cup, an expanded Club World Cup, right? Now, part of the lure or the sale of the previous Club World Cup was that there was going to be $250 million distributed to non-participating clubs. And as we sit here today, that still hasn't happened, right? So again, I'm not saying that out of itself is an absolute knockout blow with regards to the point I'm trying to make. But I'm saying is that it's important that decision making at that level is scrutinized, and it needs to be done, because without it, there's a danger that we end up where that integrity of the game and everything, like you say, we spoke about earlier, is eroded. And it's the interests of a select group that are at the forefront of all of these things. And I don't think anybody wants that.
I'm sure all football fans listening to this would agree with you, but as I'm sure you also understand, these things are an enormous challenge. But congratulations to you and the UEC coming up with these 3 really interesting proposals. People can no doubt go to your website and read more about them. Thank you for explaining them. I think everyone will be very interested to see how you progress with these.
Thanks for joining us on The Business Behind Sport. If you enjoyed the conversation, make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Our global sports advisory team supports the sector, investors and partners by helping them better manage change, challenges and opportunities. You can explore our latest insights and learn more about how we support clients across industries at ankura.com.